Hello, and welcome to another show of Around the Coin. We have the three of us here today, which is always great kindling wood for a fantastic conversation. Today's pre-show, we narrowed in on the idea of economic literacy crash course, and that may encompass a wide range of topics, and each of them have been vetted out in a thorough pre-show, discussing things from how the ultra-wealthy manage money and the derivatives markets, to understanding capitalism and socialism, to specific countries and how those political systems operate. And this topic and this conversation today will be a bit of a free-range discussion on those ideas and take it where it goes, because I think we have a lot of great directions we can go. I think the first one, guys, we'll start to dive into is the idea of capitalism, socialism, any other ism we want to throw in there in between the spectrum, as it becomes quite relevant in today's political environment. In the United States especially, there is a recognizable growing trend of people, I would say led by Congresswoman AOC, who really pushes this narrative that capitalism is a fundamentally flawed operating system for society. And I don't have any specific, personally, I don't have any specific goals other than to make truly transparent and truthful what the ideas behind these words mean. Capitalism, socialism, any kind of government subsidy program we can look at as cycles, and in history learn from what has already happened. And if there's any sort of central goal for our conversation collectively at the podcast, I look at it as taking lessons through history and presenting them in ways that are so obvious that it's undeniable that they are part of bigger and broader cycles that you can learn from and sort of not only predict the future, but hedge it in a direction that you see better to go in. You know, there are definitely better and worse pathways to move forward in society. So I think as podcasters, it's part of our responsibility to transmit information that's truthful and non-biased as much as we can do so, to help people develop a mental model, a framework for living in this complex world. So with that introduction, I'm going to give a quick rundown or a Wikipedia Urban Dictionary definition of capitalism, and then we'll dive in. So capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production, which personal, individual products can be exchange between different people in society, and the accumulation, the private property, wage labor, price system are independent capital markets. So basically it says that the government has minimal, if any, intervention in the exchange of information and value. Where the government comes in is they have a police force, they take care of the military, and the government also in a capitalist society can provide for a minimum safety net. There's no exclusivity of in capitalist viewpoints to say that we can't also provide a social net. So in some ways, the idea of Medicaid, or that concept of helping people who truly need help, and capitalism don't mesh together. And I think that's a bit of an illusion that tends to grade the discussion. So I think strictly a capitalist would say that things like minimum wage, it is not an effective and productive policy, that government subsidies for college education are not good in the long run, that some of these ideas that sound good in the short term, because they go against a capitalist ethos, really don't pay off in the long run. So with that, I will open it up to you guys to jump in and criticize how I framed that initial conversation, or give your reactions to that.
Well, thank you, Mike. Good to be here. Good to have Faisal back. You know, I don't think it's actually criticism to examine what a lot of neo-intellectuals produce on capitalism versus communism and socialism and fascism. All these isms are really bromides that are put together to try to put in a bag a collection of ideas. I tend not to actually like to use those terms. Here's how I like to look at it. Humans think, they produce, and they have to deal with others on mutually beneficial terms. Now, this sounds like, very simple premises, but these are first order premises. So with that in mind, since knowledge, thinking, and rational actions are properties of an individual, and since the choice to exercise rational faculties and abilities depends on individuals, survival requires that those who think free and want no interference usually wind up doing better in the world. And since nobody is infallible and nobody's omniscient, and whether you democratically say you're omniscient and infallible or not, no single person is and no group is, we must be able to agree on a mutually beneficial term. We have to cooperate. So this cooperation is based upon your life energy, your ability to produce your given right to exist as an individual. Now that's the reality. That's the first order premises. And I've talked decades with people about this, and even your most diehard isms on either side all agree on this. Some people might think, well, Brian, that sounds more capitalistic. It isn't. It's humanistic. It's how we are. So the question then becomes, how does one take away the things that an individual creates, their work product, forcibly by gun, and take it and redistribute it to somebody else? So you have to first answer that moral question. And that is always going to be the problem. And when you don't answer that question and everything you build upon that structure, it becomes as weak as not answering that question. So what does this mean? It means that since no one person can be omniscient and infallible, no group can be omniscient and infallible. And what that means is if somebody's taking 50, 75% of my work product and they are somehow going to do good with it, how does that work? Are they in better possession of faculties and information? So we can kind of look in reality. So we're talking in first order premises here. And we can look in reality in different governmental systems. And we can say the governmental systems that actually use these labels to term who they were, how successful were they in history? How did they work out? How long did they last? What did they do to their people? And what ultimately happens in all circumstances, there's this, well, if. And the problem is that if. The problem is when you put people, an individual, people like to call that fascism, or a group, people like to call that collectivism, socialism, communism. They're the same thing. In control over the individual, they're going to make some bad mistakes. And they go down what is called the proverbial slippery slope. Ultimately, this is not my analysis. It's history. It's irrefutable. It's irrefutable. So whenever you give up your individual rights to do with what you want to do with your work product of your existence, and you no longer are creating mutually beneficial terms, meaning that I agree to this. I mean, just because you're born in this country or any other country, you are forced to agree with those terms. You're not mutually beneficially agreeing to those terms. You're forced to. That's the other issue. It's like, well, you live in this country. No, I didn't choose to be born. I've never met anybody who chose, that can prove to me they chose to be born anywhere in this world, but they were. And
this is like John Rawls' veil of ignorance. You want to design a society such that if you were randomly born into it, you would enjoy your life.
That's exactly the premise. So now when and 2020 is going to be a big time for this, because when you're dealing with people who try to use these terminologies, they never go to first premises. They always go, I don't want to waste my time with that. Stop slowing this whole thing down. I have a $300,000 student debt, and somebody says that they're going to erase it when they go into office, and that's going to be fine. Or I'm running a company, and these slobs are getting paid too much. I want to pay them $1.10 an hour and stop getting in my way. People think that it's either or. It isn't. None of those. First off, that's not capitalism. And second off, the other thing isn't really socialism. It's fascism. There's really, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as socialism or communism. It's just fascism. And that gets me in a lot of trouble with folks, but this study of the history, fascism is centralized control against an individual.
So do you agree with this notion that if capitalism is left unrestrained, in that such to say that there's no government intervention on things like minimum wage or overtime payments, all the systems we now have in place and are increasingly start to edge into society. If capitalism is left unrestrained, does it lead to this distribution of ultra wealthy and ultra poor? If the system is a blank slate from start, is it inevitable that society ends in that paradigm, which is not, I think most people, everyone to some extent, would agree that that's not a healthy recipe for a healthy, thriving society in the future.
The thing is, the thing, I hear where you're going with this. The thing is, we're all here now, right? So we have a prima facie evidence that somehow humans overcame all the tyrannical dictators that thought that their square inch of land was going to be theirs forever. Well, they're dead and they're dust, right? So it didn't really make any difference. We're going to survive all of these mechanisms that humanity tries to push forward as a control to how we're going to evolve and live. In 1,000 years, 10,000 years, all these debates will be sort of irrelevant. And most people think it's going to be a sterile world where everybody wears a white jumpsuit and walks around in white buildings with glass. That's not how it's going to be. It's never how it's going to be. That's not what humans are about. That's how people fantasize it's going to be. And somehow we don't have money and we just kind of walk around and we just do whatever in our space stations and somehow we just know what to do. That's not going to work either. It never has and it never will. So what life has proven, history and humanity has proven, is that it's never clear. It's never a simple thing, but there is underlying premises that always exist. And that is, the underlying premise is that we must operate on mutually beneficial terms. And again, I go to first order premises. If we do not operate under mutually beneficial terms where I'm getting the same deal that you are, then we've officially stopped having an agreement. And when we don't have an agreement, we don't really have a society.
So this would be something like universal basic income is the topic that comes up, which is basically taking money wherever taxes come from. I think the source of the money is not as much emphasized, but the distribution aspect is innovative in that you're spreading it to universal implies everybody. And that's up for debate, but universally you give everyone some fixed amount of money.
Here's a question. And
then the idea of that is you then replace the existing programs, which are difficult to interact with, difficult to actually get funds from. If you were to just give people money, that would be more efficient interjection. Anyways, not arguing for it or against it, just framing it as a topic.
So here's a question. What if somebody says they don't want to participate in that and they don't want to give their money? What happens to that person?
I mean, they would be fined. They'd eventually be, thrown in jail or fined for it, and eventually,
coerced under gunpoint, right? So, is that a mutually beneficial transaction? If that person doesn't feel that they want to participate, is it mutually beneficial at that point?
No, definitely not.
Okay, so what we're basically doing is we're creating a system where a group can have control over an individual. And that group can vote away your rights and your freedoms at will. And all I can tell you is whenever that happens in history, it ultimately breaks. What the reason why Mike and I are in the United States, Faisal has been here. One of the reasons we're in the United States is because people broke away from central control and authority called the king. They had divine authority to be the king and the queen, right? And we said, to hell with that. You don't have any rights over me. I'm a sovereign. I'm a sovereign individual. I have inalienable rights.
But you'd agree, though...
Hold it. What ultimately happens is this is not really a philosophical or intellectual debate. It's the most real you can ever get. And a lot of people think, oh, Brian, you're talking philosophically, and it's very, very real. The moment that you're able to take away somebody's right to make their own choice, you have doomed your great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to hell. It never, ever, ever has worked. So this is not about socialism or capitalism, because we don't really live in those worlds right now. I mean, we live in a world right now where the inequities of the system that we created out of good intention, there ought to be a law. So we create a law, and that law creates an imperfection in the ability for businesses to compete, and it favors some businesses over others. It creates an imbalance of wealth. That imbalance of wealth makes capitalism, quote unquote, look unfair. And it is at that point because somebody used political might and political machinations through laws and rules and political contributions, we will say, to favor one individual group or industry over another. And when you do that, then you no longer have anything that's capitalism. You have a form of social engineered communism or socialism at that point.
It's difficult.
It really isn't capitalism. So when people are going to be talking over the next 24... Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think the area where you get some rub is specific programs that may be good for society as a whole or may not be. If you were to say the military it benefits everyone. Roads benefit just about everyone who has a car in the United States. What about public education? Does that benefit everyone? I would say yes, because I'd rather live in a society where people are educated because they can vote better and we get better politics. There's a lot of ROI.
But the question is, how did we get here? The idea of put it this way, we had roads, we had a military, we had a postal system, we had public education, the best in the world, for pretty much 120 odd years before it became a social, centralized federal type of system. People freely invited teachers. If you look at the development of the West, it's a beautiful study of macro economics. It was hard to get teachers to come to the West because it just wasn't where people wanted to go. And so the farmers and the ranchers said, gosh, we're going to have to advertise. So groups of farmers got together. They formed what essentially are now towns, and they put advertisements in the New York and Chicago newspapers and said, you get a house, you get a horse, you get a couple of chickens, you get a cow, and you get this much money, and you get a schoolhouse. Come and teach our kids. And it worked brilliantly. Now people say that doesn't scale. Of course it scales. The education wasn't good. Well, how the heck did we get here? Well, when we live in a more complex world, that's true. I meet a lot of people who go through engineering classes at universities, and they couldn't design a modern operating system or program beyond the 4 or 5 different popular languages. I'm not saying that that's bad or good.
It seems like the major challenge is, how does a citizen, what framework or mental model does an average citizen who puts in a reasonable amount of time into educating themselves about political structures and policies, how do they decide whether or not to support a specific policy? Like should preschool be funded by the government? Should we continue to subsidize corn for the population? Should we another one that's coming up is, should we give uncapped or maybe capped but free, interest-free college loans to students? These kind of topics come up and they sound convincing, from a politician who has a clear objective to get it passed and use it as his central campaign. So I think developing a mental model to say, all right, well, what happens if that happens? What change to the system does that affect?
Just look at the model around the world, where if that is a great idea, right? Look at where innovation comes from. Where are the most innovative people in the world? Where do they want to be? What system do they want to work under? What's the motivation? And would a centralized authority allow somebody like Steve Jobs to exist? That's your question. My question to anybody listening to me is, listen, I love when people want to give me something for free. Give me free education, give me free money, give me free food, give me free housing, everything for free. And let's get those rich bastards to give all their money up so I don't have to work. That's great. Now the question would be careful what you wish for. Would the system allow Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, who was refused college, who was kicked out of high school, Steve Jobs, who couldn't really get a job anywhere? Look at his resume. I can give a link to anybody to look at his resume. The resume was a joke. Would these Bill Gates? I mean, now Bill Gates is a slightly different story. Elon Musk. All right. All of these folks, would they exist in this system? Oh, but Brian, hold it. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I still want those people to exist. I still want them to work their ass off. I still want them to maybe die young.
What you're saying, Brian, is that you want a system that has the economic incentives, because that's all there ever is incentives for people. And you want the incentives to align such that if you work really hard and build something very valuable for other people, that you will get rewarded financially for it. And if you remove that incentive or scale that incentive down, then you just get a response from society that there will be less people pursuing broad and ambitious topics that can dramatically change the world.
There's nothing wrong with this. I have friends that went to Cuba and they like driving around in 1950s vehicles. I mean, they're beautiful.
So.
They're beautiful. Those cars are awesome. Now, what I'm trying to say is,
behind the scenes, Cuba is not a place you want to be.
Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah.
But Mike, when you don't have access to knowledge, when you don't study history, and you're perfectly able to go down slippery slopes because somehow you think your foothold is better than somebody else's. Okay, I found a good rock on the side of this mountain. It's a slippery slope. I believe that, but my slippery slope's a little better. I'm going to fortify myself here, and I'm never going to go this slipped again. Oh, I'm slipping again. Oh, all right. I'm not going to go. Oh, I'm slipping down the hill. Okay, no, okay, 75% tax rate. No, 90%. All of a sudden now you're saying, okay, keep achieving, but if you get too big, we're going to cut your legs off. You cannot be an oak tree in this forest because you're going to get too big. If you're an oak, we want everybody to be, maybe a small tree. We want it to share the forest. Nature doesn't give a crap about these philosophies. If you look at nature finds a balance. Nature finds cooperation. Nature's been around a few billion years. And so when I go and I try to find a theory or a philosophy or a way to solve a problem, the very first place I go to is the scientific experiment called evolution in nature. And this isn't survival of the fittest. And that's a wrong analogy of this. It's the survival of the most adapted to the particular ecosystem. So when I go into the forest, if you were to cut down all the big trees in a forest because it's stealing all the sunlight from all the small plants, have you really saved that forest? What have you done?
I think your point is that nature represents in some sense, a completely capitalist society where there's just pure exchange of value and information.
It is called laissez-faire is what it's really called.
All right, so that's kind of interesting, right? So that humans now develop this system where we say, hey, we care about each other enough so that when we have resources enough to save each other from starvation or hurting each other, like healthcare, we're going to do that. We value something more than just a pure survival of the fittest.
Well, it isn't. It actually isn't. It isn't. So we have to get the first premises down very clearly. If you've ever spent a lot of time in nature, I don't think you've ever, even if you're going to the African safari and there's a lion chasing a gazelle, okay? If you've spent a lot of time in nature and really just zoned out everything and just observed, nothing is struggling. There is no fight for survival. And it's not below the surface. If you look really close, everybody's fighting. Nobody is fighting. Everything is cooperating. That is nature, in fact, by definition. And so we humans come along and we intellectualize this. And we say, oh, no. We know better. We know how to fix this. Nature is not working perfectly. Good luck with that. We've always been wrong. Every time we tried to double guess nature, well, this is an invalid organ in the body. It's vestigial. We'll cut it off. Oops. Now it turns out it's important for your immune system.
Yeah,
but
it's
we didn't
difficult
know.
to measure that.
Yeah. So the question is, all right, do I mean you create a system that's cruel? There's never been a human system that's been cruel other than the ones who've put together to try to help people. See, when you look at how society normally organizes, it organizes in pods and groups. We call them family, tribes, and organizational units. We take care of our own. We always have on a local level. On a local level. Somebody, if in fact the onus was on you to take care of your family and the people you love, and that there was nobody else that was going to take care of them but you, the responsibility rightly falls on the local group. And
yeah, I've heard this. I've heard this thought experiment. To your point here, that on a federal level, you want complete capitalism. On a local level, you want some form of moderate socialism.
It's not socialism.
On a family level, you want a dictatorship.
Yeah, and I try not to use those terms. So what I call that is love. See, I transcend all this.
Right.
Basically, if you love something, you take care of it. And so let's remove the terms from it. If you love people, you give them your money, you give them your time, you give them your energy.
But I think as you get further abstracted from the people who are collecting and redistributing, it's more difficult. It just requires a framework of thinking that.
But why does it have to go high? Why does it have to go centrally? You know, we're in a decentralized world. We're just communicating through it right now. It's called the internet, right? It seems to work.
I think centrally.
There's no AOL in the middle.
People attach to ideas of countries, right? Countries are kind of a foundational human structure right now, and
countries
they're
are people,
but they very much are consolidated financial systems and economic systems.
Yeah,
and
that's only because we voted away the ability for us to take care of it locally. See, listen, it's not me saying this. If somebody were to take a time capsule and look at this 1,000 years from now, it's of course going to be right. What ultimately is going to happen is everything's going to go back to local. It always does, and it always will. And sometimes it's got to disintegrate to that. Somehow we wake up and we rediscover that love is the underlying theme and theory of nature and existence. And it's not New Age philosophy. I define love as the premise of why we're here, you know. And so if everybody took care of their own, you would not need any of these other systems.
Well, I think to your point, people start wars out of love. I mean, that's what drives killing many times is protecting of other people.
They start wars out of fear. Do not mistake this.
I think both can exist.
No.
Like you can actually. Well, think about it on a micro sense. Why would a male lion fight another male lion to death? Like they're doing it out of love for the female. They each want a drive to protect the family or do something.
Actually, that doesn't happen. Animals don't kill each other to the death. They kill each other. They kill each other for the reproduction rights of the female. And that is out of...
Just say, okay, well, let's draw in a very basic sense. Why would a cheetah hunt a prey? Well, he would do so for the love of her children to provide food for them to keep them alive.
So
the same reason why...
Humans are the only species that, out of a lack of love, will kill another human being. Other species don't do that. Humans kill for only one reason, for fear. They don't do it out of love. That becomes a justification ex post facto. And I've studied this, and it's
I mean, there are chimpanzees who will gang up and kill somebody else in the group, kill another male in the group.
That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen unless there is something else that's taking place. Now, when you're talking about if you're talking about primal aggression among simians, okay, primal aggression among simians are first off extremely rare. Second off, when Arthur C. Clarke was writing the screenplay for 2001. And Kubrick said we need to invent the tool, and the tool became the first weapon, and the first time the chimpanzee beat another chimpanzee over the head with this weapon. A lot of people don't understand the backstory to that. Arthur C. Clarke said simians are not naturally aggressive, and only humans are. And there is really not
we'll have to check afterwards. I don't think that's true. Faisal, I want to reel you in here. Where do you feel we were talking about the political structure, really economic framework of various countries and the sort of the spectrum that lies between vaguely this concept of socialism, fascism, all the way to more on the capitalism, libertarian side, where just power and resources are either pooled centrally and then redistributed, or they're just left completely distributed from the start. Do you have a sense for where we are now, and maybe some ideas? We were talking pre-show about how money is both distributed initially, created from the Federal Reserve, and then how it's liquidated into the derivatives market. And some of the ideas you were talking about earlier were very fascinating.
Well,
Faisal,
where's Faisal?
Faisal, we tuning in to the Faisal frequency?
Yeah.
Right. He may have dropped out there.
Okay, well, I don't know where Faisal went. He was having a bad connection for a while there. Let's look at this. When you look at the very first financial systems, they were barter systems, right? We had a mutual agreeable contract between one person and another. I will do X and you will do Y. I will trade X and you will trade Y, and you have an agreement. There really wasn't a governmental system other than golden rule: do unto others as you do unto yourselves.
Well, that's where you have to start.
Sure.
I mean, there's no motivation to start anywhere else.
So now the question becomes, if you go from that first order premise, and that's a financial, all of this is all based on finance, by the way, and finance ultimately comes into human control, et cetera. But let's just look at it from that first order premise. What's wrong with that? Well, we need an abstraction. Okay, so you and I agree that beads, or this thing called a shekel, a Sumerian ring coin, is going to be representative or symbolic of X. What is X?
Give me a time period here. Give me a location.
So,
and time
all right. So I'll give Sumeria. I'll give Sumeria about 6,000 years ago.
We're going way back.
Yeah. So basically, the very first financial unit happened by accident, and this is where the system worked. So if you were living between the Tigris and Euphrates, and what we would otherwise call the Sumerian area, and groups of families formed bonds and tribes, and they formed their own religious belief systems. These religious belief systems came from almost 10,000 years earlier. They were essentially cobbled together from the Druids and Irish and pre-Egyptians, things like that. I mean, you go to these ancient civilizations, they predate Egypt by 50,000 years. So, if you go to those and they say, okay, how do we bind ourselves together? We bind each other together by family and belief. What's our central belief in our religious or philosophical construct and how we want to live? And so they formed their very first temples. And the temples were kind of the first quasi-governments. And these were very locally driven. They didn't group together. They were very regionalized studies of what their God structure or practices would be like. And so what they said is, well, to support this system, to help our group, I'm going to give a share of wheat, which was the primary source of income for that part of the world, all the way to Turkey. That's where the modern wheat was invented. Some say almost 30,000 years ago, pre-Göbekli Tepe even. But they gave this wheat to the temple voluntarily. They said, listen, this is something I feel good about. I want to give you a share of wheat. So the temple gave a loyalty point reward system back. It's called a shekel, which means share, wheat, share of wheat. And so what it basically did is these rings you would put around a leather band and would show that you're supporting this particular temple. And over time, people said, that made you valuable. You're helping our community. So there was social reward points to that, but there was also this idea of forming this tightly bound community. In that period of time, there were almost no wars. There was a period of time where there were 5,000 years where people weren't beating each other over the head. In fact, even previous to that.
So what records do we really have to have any clue about that?
Oh, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy through the.
I don't know.
I can tell you, the archaeological record is pretty easy.
That's true. That's true.
How do we know? We dig up people, right? And we see their bodies. Unfortunately, when you kill somebody, you kind of leave some evidence if their skull is cracked open or there's an arrow pinged into their heart, and where their heart would have been. So we, as archaeologists, but after a while, if a certain period of strata, you see no examples of really violent activity, you can fairly conclude that major wars didn't take place and people lived in harmony. We certainly could say that about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is easily the oldest society, and there's absolutely no signs of aggression in that particular period of time. And, one can conclude fairly easily that when people are able to organize freely amongst themselves, they freely trade amongst parties, and they tend not to want to beat each other over the head. It's usually when you have a central authority that's dictating down what you have to do and what you must do that creates this aggression. But then I'll let people go and research that.
Can we fast forward? Use that framework to then fast forward say. United States after the great, we talked about the corn subsidies, which I find interesting because they were really the first time it was a large maybe not the first time, but a large centralized governmental policy to address a backlash to a specific catastrophe that just happened. Many people just got, kind of just finished or in the midst of a Great Depression where starvation was a primary concern. And so we're going to take centralized money that we pool from everyone, and we're going to help farmers to produce consistent crops. And we talked about, I don't want to go down the road of farmers too much because we talked about that last show, but looking at it as a framework of, through the lens of, that's more of a socialist movement. And now I think whether or not you could argue it was beneficial or not is probably debatable, but now there has to be a point at which we reflect on those policies. And when the world changes enough so that those policies are completely they're completely stale, they're not useful to us anymore. It seems to me that the United States in particular does not have a good framework for dropping old policies that it benefit the incumbents in the space, because the incumbents now have the power. Politically, they have the funding, and then they fund politicians, and there's that vicious cycle of political influence.
Exactly.
And so it's difficult to drain that out. How do you pull away resources from that which is no longer useful to the masses? And in many ways, people are. This is almost in some sense, it always comes down to psychology, which always comes down to biology, chemistry, physics, and math. In some sense, we are fallible to this idea that if something is just running, and it is the way it is, and it's kind of a level of abstraction below my primary concerns in life. If I purchase something at the store, I can see the price of that, but you can't really see inflation, for instance, and you can't really see government subsidies going to corn producers that then make the cost of corn cheaper and everything else slightly more expensive. It's difficult in some ways. I think about how do we drop that? How do we correctly assess systems and drop that which is not needed anymore?
I got the answer. More laws, more rules, more centralized control, more bureaucrats, more authority. And not just on a central level. Let's put them everywhere. Let's put them in every industry. Let's put a commissar in every factory. Let's put them in every production line, and then that'll fix it. See, the problem with the scalability of this centralized control is it knows no end. So the opposite might be, hold it. Let me look at unintended outcomes. The outcome of subsidizing corn sounds great, until you see the unintended circumstances that are very pervasive, and they cycle through not only the economy, but through everybody's lives. The reason why we have eliminated the topsoil in most of the United States is by over-farming. The only reason any farmer would over-farm against their best interest, destroying their lands, and knowing they know they're doing it, is because they're getting paid to do it. There's a centralized authority that's saying
crazy incentives.
Okay, so if the local agricultural commissar says, "Hey, you keep planting corn until that corn can't grow, and then I'm going to give you a GMO, this corn and that corn, and it's going to grow even more. But I know we're raping the soil, but hey, we're going to hell in a handbasket, so let's not worry about it. We'll pass it on to the next generation." See, a lot of people think that centralized control is much more favorable to the future. For somehow it's got this vision on 200 years of saving the future. Show me where that's worked.
To be honest, Brian, I mean, I struggle with finding compelling ideas in socialism, and I do an honest job of pursuing the best, what is publicly viewed as the best thinkers in socialist kind of leadership circles. I guess Noam Chomsky would be a big one.
I love him. I think he's
a big one.
Yeah, I've read all these guys.
They're rational ideas to some extent, but they're painting a picture that, in my view, my mental framework, does not coincide with a reasonable outcome or even a likely outcome.
Well, if you go to first order premises, the only way it works is that you need a local commissar to beat somebody over the head when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Right? So there's no
so clearly
free will.
You're not in favor of socialist ideas.
Well, please explain it to me. I love people who are really wise about this. I actually think there's a lot of ideas that are great. It's just not really thought out. To make this whole thing work is that you have to tell somebody, if they don't go and do X number of things exactly this way, that you're going to be put in jail or you're going to be beat up. Now, and literally what I mean is beat up, because that is a motivational system in a socialistic environment. Is that you basically say get in there and put your time into the collective farm. And you are no longer an individual. You're now a cog in a bigger wheel for a greater good. What is that greater good if it's not for the individual? So you go back to the first order premises. Now imagine if it was voluntary. Imagine that your self-interests were aligned with the self-interests of the people around you, and you all were working together. I tell you, and a lot of people get really mad at me about this, is that the pyramids were not built by slaves. They never have, they never could be, and they never would. You cannot get a slave to build something so accurate and so brilliant and so beautiful. You will kill them before they ever get to their work output. And there aren't enough people mathematically alive since the beginning of history that you can whip on the back to make that rock so flat that it is perfect and it doesn't require mortar.
So what are the
let me tell you this. This is so important. You can only do that out of love. And you can only do that not being hypnotized, but by aligned interest to build something that you want to do, not for the greater good.
I mean, sadly enough, there have been a lot of hugely economically impactful things in society in recent times, the last few hundred years, that as chaotic and sad as it is, have been a foundation of slavery, which is a dark past that we must learn from.
Well, let's look at that.
I get you in theory.
It's not even theory. It's unsustainable. Yeah. I'm not saying it doesn't happen temporarily. I'm saying you can't build pyramids that way. You can maybe build railroads a little bit that way. You can maybe tend to some crops that way. But you are not going to produce a healthy society. Ergo, what happened? What happened is it was unsustainable, and we ripped those that whole premise of slavery apart, and we're still reeling from it because it does not work. Slavery does not work.
So let's go back to let's stay on this central theme of the socialist view now, I think, is rising in the United States, particularly because of what? Because there is a strong there's a increasingly, probably even exponentially increasingly divide between the have and the have-nots. People
absolutely
in the making over, call it like 300K per year, I would say, drawing the net somewhere. The spectrum, maybe the middle class is dissolving, I think, is what the socialist supporter would say, in favor of more socialist programs like Medicare for all, free education for everybody. These are this is quickly becoming a reality as the new election cycle starts to come around in 2020, and I just see it unfolding in a way that propaganda implies a conscious effort to convince people of something to be fraudulent. So I don't think it's propaganda in that sense. I think it's genuine belief about a bad idea will be successful, and that you convince yourself that idea will be successful. And frankly, my belief is that countries and groups of people, large groups of people, can operate in either system. You can be centralized or decentralized if everyone is bought in. And the problem is when part of the people are bought in, but part of them aren't, and there's this constant friction and divide across the whole thing. And then there's corruption in the centralization part, or there's individual corruption and individual transactions. So there's ways that both systems can break down. But I do think that the socialist framework is, in some sense, fundamentally pure socialism, just like pure libertarian is also going to be fundamentally flawed. But I question right now in time, with the technology that we have, with the sophistication and communication that we have, and the general global political climate, are we in a position to completely fund education and say the United States is going to pool money from all its taxpayers, every citizen, and we are going to pay for education, higher education, because we view that in-person brick and mortar schools are the future? And that's where it just, to me, breaks down. It's not necessarily that we are pooling money and giving it to a specific objective. The problem that I have is that the specific objective is flawed. Like the old school way of sending people to college, number one, it educates them, sure. They get interaction with other students, sure. They pay a tremendous amount of money for it, which is where I see the rub. Is there other ways to interact with other people? Are you going to find ways to socialize between your 18-year-old and your 22-year-old years? And I view that as yes. Are you going to find a way to get educated? There's billions of ways to take online courses online right now for 1/100th the cost of that. So you can learn what you want to learn. You could interact with people the same way. And I view that the trajectory of the future for education in particular, namely because it's one of the few major topics in conversation today politically, is education is not headed towards more universities, more brick and mortars, more student loan debt. It's headed towards a completely ubiquitous and free flow of information and education online. And that could be tutors online. It could be a VR headset. It can involve a real in-person education as well. But it just does not need to be as inefficient as it is today. And if there's anything to deflate, it's that idea.
So Mike, let's look at this again, right? So in a centralized...
Brian, by the way, the more you can disagree with me, the better.
No,
I feel like we agree on a lot of this stuff.
No, it's hard to disagree because I resonate with basically everything you say. But let's look at the idea of centralization, right? So if everybody gets free education, what if I want to get a PhD in I don't know, something that may not sound very useful, like I don't know, knitting or something. Let's just say the machines can do that better. Why are you getting a PhD in something like knitting? Well, I'll tell you what certainly happens. What happens is a central authority will now say, listen, since you're getting a free education, we're going to tell you what the future is going to be. And this is for your own good, by the way, because we're smarter than you are. Again, there's this whole idea that groups of individuals somehow are going to be smarter than the individual. And we're smarter than you. And we're going to tell you the future is learn to code. In fact, here's a uniform. It's a malware. Here's a jacket. We're all going to learn to code. Code. Until 2039, and nobody needs coders to the degree that they did before. Because why? By about that time, AI is going to be writing almost 90% of code. 90% of it. But who's going to take care of the AI? Well, a whole hell of a lot less folks. So if the answer was, we're going to have some centralized commissars starting to predict the 100-year plan, and this is how we need to build production. And what's flawed with that is it's never worked, even with farming. Something as simple as food and farming. United States free organization, even with farm subsidies, did much better than the centralized 500-year, 100-year plans of these other systems. So my problem with education is, what is it there for? What is it really there for? Well, my fundamental thing about education is not what you're learning. It's learning how to think. It's learning the ability to discern. It's learning the ability to research. And it's learning the ability to understand one thing that we throw out the door, and that's history. The fundamental purpose of education was to teach history. History gives you a foundation, and it comes under different words, but I'll use the word history. Sociology, anthropology, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we can go backwards, but the idea is you're learning how to think, and you're learning how others thought, and you're learning how problems were solved, and you're learning how other lives took place and where they made failings. And what we hope to do by writing books and by transferring knowledge forward is not our egos. If we're trying to tell the next generation, don't screw up the way we did. So I tell anybody who wants to have this debate is read about Russian socialism and communism. Read about Chinese socialism and communism. And I have friends that are in both countries, and I can tell you, they're laughing their ass off. Because while we are rapidly trying to approach a system that they've already invalidated on the backs of, I cannot.
It has to, but it has to. You have to pull it down to something that you have to take those stories and ideas and transmute them into your everyday life in a way that is concretely realistic.
Right, education.
And I think a lot of people would look at that and say, "Oh, well, that was a long time ago. Now we have technology. That was a different culture.
Different technology.
Now it's."
The patina of technology makes it better.
It's a very valid. I mean, it is a argument. To the degree it's believable is debatable, but it is a point worth making.
It's an argument that Elvis is still alive and he's talking to aliens. I mean, listen, if you don't want to even believe, I'm not saying this to you, but I'm saying anybody who's having this debate, if you don't want to believe that humans have already gone through pretty much everything that any human has ever gone through in the past, there is nothing new. I mean, the technology doesn't change anything. It does magnify to a certain extent, and you can factor that in. But humans are always going to respond the same way they always have to certain scenarios.
I probably in some ways disagree with that. I think technology does create the opportunity to have different organizational systems that were not possible before. Namely, I guess objectively, the blockchain and cryptocurrency is one decentralized currency system that can't exist now.
What I mean by that is I'm using the lowercase t in technology. Technology is all humans create. Of course, technology changes how humans organize. What I'm saying is we paint this patina of technology that we have today that somehow it's much more magical. It's really magnifying the things that we have today. Do you know what a blockchain is? It's a freaking database. You know what a database is? It's a storage and archival system. Do you want to know when that was invented? Oh, just about, 5 to 10 million years ago. It's not new. The organizational system is just more magnified because we have higher and uniform access to it. The difference in technology, we talked about this in the last show, was the individual has power to communicate over great distances and to larger groups and larger communities. And that's only happened over the last 15 years on a greater extent to the larger extent of the population. And we're infancies into this. And the reaction to those in greater control are we're going to have to start shutting it down and controlling it because we don't want certain forms of communication today, more forms of communication later, and then later on it's pretty much all forms of communication. Because essentially we are living through a transformational period where your ideas can be widely spread. And unfortunately, they could be quote-unquote true or quote-unquote false. But some central authority is going to have to determine that, and that's what we're going through again. And so getting back to the educational thing is, let's all have free education. Great. Now, where do we go from there? What are you going to go and learn? Well, you're going to have to learn something productive so you can be a productive member of society. Well, today it's up to your free will. and you make a bet. Well, I'm going to be a med tech, or I'm going to be in this medicine, I'm going to be in that law, and I'm going to be in this. And it turns out you might make the wrong thing. In my life as a merchant account provider, I have known thousands of attorneys that literally walked away from their job. I've known thousands of doctors that gave up their practices and they opened up restaurants. They opened up window repair shops. They opened up welding art companies, all sorts of things. And I talked to these folks and I said, hey, Bill, you're a Yale law school graduate, and you're walking away from a firm as a partner in New York City. Why? I realized I don't want to be a lawyer, and I'm facing the burden financially to go and do
burnout.
what I want.
I mean, the other thing that
it's not even burnout. It's not even burnout. A lot of that's the wrong thing to see this as. I don't want to give any illusions. I'm not talking about people burning out. I'm talking about people who woke up. And it's not like a religious thing. Is they're in the middle of that job and they said, this is not what I expected. I see it very much in doctors and lawyers because you put so much effort and energy to get to the degree. You're giving up a lot of your young life, and then you get immersed into it, and it turns out it is a system that you didn't imagine existed. And
I think I'd agree with you that technology drives the urgency for some of these topics to be discussed. I think now the concept of universal basic income has become more on the table. We talked about the other two large, I think, debate points of healthcare being the idea of everyone getting healthcare is it's such a easy thing to say and such a difficult thing to define and implement because the details of it are not as simple as that. Healthcare is not like water where everyone is just full.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
I have friends who've been a product of universal healthcare in other countries. All of them come to America to get treatment for major diseases. Here's a problem. The problem is, if everybody gets health care and the system is going to be giving you treatments that it may not think you deserve because the calculations on their actuarial table say, listen, you're 79 years old. I know you got pains and aches. We're not going to replace your hips. You're going to be dying in about 3-4 years, according to our statistics. So I'm going to give you more pain pills because it's going to cost our brothers and sisters less money. Isn't that fair? That's fair because you're taking up too many resources, old man and old lady. Let's, listen. You've had a good life. Let the young folks get the health insurance that they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere, what you're saying is that there has to be a decision from some central body to say what a certain person is allowed to get.
That's right.
And beyond, if they need something beyond that to live, then they don't get it. Now, I think the
is that the world? Is that the world you want to live in? I mean, you're a young, healthy guy, but I'm telling you, ask your parents.
Well, I think right now people would say that there's currently that reality that currently exists, that people are limited by the resources that. Well, no, they are limited. If say you take the other framework, which is everyone pay for their own healthcare 100%, and so you're then limited with each individual's ability to financially pay for their own healthcare. There has to be a limit.
Hold on.
Either way, it's either centralized or it's made independently.
If you ask orthopedic surgeons in the United States,
I'm married to one, so I could tell you.
That's right. Do you want to know how many orthopedic surgeries don't take place in socialized systems? They will tell you that you're not worth having your knees or hips replaced. That's the final analysis.
No, I'm agreeing with you. But I would also just emphasize that people are individually being forced with the same constraints in both systems.
Well, no, that's Mike. It's very important not to conflate these things because one is very maniacal and one is a product of finance. The maniacal is when you have a group of individuals who have assigned themselves the authority to tell you whether or not you have the ability to live any longer. I think when we start getting down that road, you can see that it is not just a slippery slope. It is planned euthanasia. And you're already seeing it. There's some countries saying, yeah, if you're too
But
old,
even then, Brian, if you had the financial resources, you wouldn't be subject to that. Think of it as like
that's not the case.
A safety net. So people who have nothing have that as an alternative.
In a perfectly socialistic society, you would not have the ability to go out and get yourself hip surgery because it would be illegal. See, basically what ultimately will happen is as a system like this permeates, the unfairness of somebody being able to get their hip surgery and somebody else not is just intolerable. So
I've never heard of limits like the government in a social. I've never thought of socialism as blocking people from making purchases. Right? It's kind of the concept that people pool resources together for fundamental needs.
Go to the United Kingdom and go to Canada, and ask the people who are waiting in line to get these surgeries, not because there aren't doctors, is because there is a lottery system that's in place, even for the people who want to pay for it. Okay? So, the problem is you don't really know it until you're in it. And then once you're in it, like the boiling pot of soup.
We're kind of talking past each other to some extent. What I'm saying is that theoretically, the structure of the political system allows for people to not only purchase within the government provided programs, which is true. But what you're saying is that in reality, people don't have the resources. There are no providers locally available because the providers don't have a market. People aren't paying them enough. So in reality, there are no other options. That people are jumping in line in lotteries and they're waiting a long time, even just to pay for them themselves. I agree with you.
I had a friend who is very very well known now in Hollywood. He came from the United Kingdom, and his mom was diagnosed with a brain lesion that was cancerous. And she went to see 5 doctors, and all of them said the results of a surgery would not improve your living conditions beyond a year or 2. Therefore, financially, it makes no sense for us to invest in a surgery. Now, she was 71 years old. This man loved his mom. And he was not very wealthy at the time. He was a friend of mine. He said, I'm coming to America to get my mom's surgery. Came to America to get his mom's surgery. Turned out she got the surgery. And it was a lot of problems to get her here, to get her on the plane. They were traveling for holiday is the reason why, not like they weren't allowed to travel. But long story short, she lived to be 107 years old. And she most assuredly would have died from that tumor. My problem is that's the medicine that we want to see come to this country. And because basically for it to work, everybody's got to be in it. It's not a safety net. It's free health care for everybody. And so now, you're going to break out of the system? Well, yeah. Well, what happens is it becomes exceedingly more and more and more and more expensive for you to do that to the point where you can't get it done. And then you're going to other third world countries, quote unquote, to get the brain surgery because you can't even afford it in your own country. See,
and people conflate the idea of healthcare insurance with healthcare as well. So, I mean, here's what I would let's kind of wrap it with a few conclusions here. My conclusion is that the end world that we want to build for is something I believe that most everyone can agree on, which is this: if you are in society and very poor, you want basic health care available to you. Even if you cannot afford that, you want to, if you break an arm or you're in a car crash, you don't want to be rejected at the door. And that's why we have EMTALA, which is an law that is in place now that if you are in desperate need of emergent care, by law, the hospital has to open their doors and give it to you. So that's in place today. That happens.
Mike, I got to point out. I got to point out. Before this law, did you observe in your life anybody on the street dying of a car crash or a broken leg, just laying on the street and nobody would take care of him in the United States ever in your entire existence? Did you ever see that?
You're asking me, would people walk up to the emergency room with
that's not what I'm saying.
No,
hold on. No, I'm just asking you a reality question. Have you in your life, and anybody listening that lives in the United States, have you ever seen anybody that's laying on the ground in the United States of America dying, literally dying, obviously bleeding profusely, or a broken leg twisted around their back, just laid on the ground and nobody taking care of them? Ever observe that?
I don't think that's the problem.
No, hold on. You got to answer the question. Have you ever observed that?
Again, I don't see it as a relevant point.
Okay, well, here's why it's a relevant point. Do you know how the United States operated with medical problems before we had this big debate? How did people get health care? Did they die? Is there in anywhere in history books in the 1800s people dying on the street because they didn't have health care? Did you ever see that? Is there any stories of that? How did it happen? How did it work?
Prior to really, I guess what you're saying is that healthcare, in some sense, in all sense, is an evolved technology and skill set that we have. There was no, there's this fantastic. Google Dwight Schrute, the guy from The Office, and he has this 1-minute interview where he says, if you're in nature, if you're in the wilderness, there is no healthcare. You just wrap your leg with a bandage and that's it. Well, and in some sense, that's true of society if you go back far enough. There just really wasn't emergent care.
Let's go to the 1800s, okay, late 1800s.
But I think you could wrap this up by saying that we now have healthcare where we didn't previously. And so it's such an important and useful life-saving technology and infrastructure we have available to us in our modern world.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is what humans do is we overcomplicate things. I'm not anti-anything. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a capitalist. I'm not any of these ists. I'm a realist if you want to be anything. What I'm trying to point out is that when people make this rhetoric about no longer are people dying because they don't have health care, it's an utter falsehood. Do some people die because they don't get certain medicines that are overly inflated, a $9 million pill or something like that? Of course. But that's a completely different argument, and socialized medicine is not going to fix that. Even socialism is not going to fix that.
But let's start with, again, if we paint the ideal scenario that we want to live in, I think we can start to narrow in on a common consensus. And that is one where if you are very poor, regardless of your age, if you don't have access to any money to pay for an emergency health procedure that you need, and most health procedures to get you, just about every health procedure to get you to a stable condition is not a $9 million operation. Typically, it's between like a $1,000 and $15,000 procedure that will get you to at least a stable position where you're not going to die in the next 24 hours. And you walk into the emergency room, and right now in our society in America, that exists. So that's something I think we all agree that we want to fund. I'm happy as a taxpayer paying for that, because if that person's in a situation where they don't have enough money to even afford an operation, I would love to pool our resources together and help that person.
But here's the point I was trying to make. The reason why you've never seen anybody on the street dying in the United States, and nobody's ever recorded that in the history of this country, is because we've always had a safety net. We didn't need a centralized government to do it. It's always been there. It always has been there.
Well,
I cannot repeat that enough. Well, hold on. I need to finish this point because I keep missing the point. Most healthcare facilities operated on a nonprofit status. They were operated by individuals whose doctors were getting more than adequately compensated. In fact, they were doing exceedingly well. And nobody really had insurance. But what they did have is benefactors. And they had people in the community that dedicated themselves to support their local hospitals. So what happened was when we broke that system apart because it didn't scale in some people's mind, which is utter ridiculousness, everything is local. When people stopped contributing to the local health facilities and started throwing their money into a big pot, all of a sudden inflation took over in healthcare, and it does not stop. If you returned everything back to its roots that you and I contributed to our local healthcare organization, And we attracted and competed for the best doctors by how much money we put into that system that allows everybody in our area to be a part of, who contributes, and the people who don't contribute, of course. All of a sudden, now we're putting things back to its first order premises. The problem is when you centralize it at a high level and you come with a gun or a bully to take the money from people, saying, you throw this into a big pot, and I know that an aspirin in a hospital costs, $170, but that's fine because the insurance companies pay and you don't need to worry about it. That's bullshit. If an insurance company is paying for it, you are. And that's the same thing with loyalty points.
I think you probably agree with me here, is that when the person that just got into a car crash and has no money and walks into an emergency room or gets carried in there, the price of that operation, the price specifically, needs to be driven down by market incentives. That people paying for operations out of pocket. Right.
There is no
people
market
paying
incentive.
I know. Again, I'm just painting a scenario which I think we all would agree would be the best possible scenario to some extent. So the price of that surgery, that operation, to get that person to a stable condition, should not be drastically inflated by governmental politics. It should be driven down by market economics over time, so that the government in the local area, and I agree with you. It could be very local. The town is funding
the more local, the better. Yeah.
Right. And so this person is now getting emergency treatment at a fair price because the price has been driven down, but the payer is the government, in this case, the local government. And then so that's one category of person.
Let me leave you with this concept. I see where you're going, but I don't want to take up your time all day. But let's leave with this concept, and I want you to really think about this and expand upon it maybe for a little bit. What if I pay a local doctor, to keep me healthy? What if I give them money? The more healthier I am, the more money I give them. How does that sound?
Right. What you're arguing for is what I was just going to say, which is the second pier, or the second pillar here of what you want a healthcare system to be. Is if you're in the middle class and relatively healthy, which most people are, you want to have a doctor available to you. And if you pay for it, you're perfectly happy paying for it. You don't need insurance because you know you're going to need it. It's not like if my house burns down, which most of the time it won't. And healthcare is something it's very predictable. It's very certain that at some point you will need it. And so when you need it, you pay for it. If it is routine, you pay for it. If it's a big catastrophic thing that happened to you that's very expensive, then you have a high deductible insurance plan for that. So there's independent market providers of insurance that are not tied down or restricted by regulations on which states they can operate in, or any other abstract concepts that artificially limit the scope of which people they can provide. But they're real healthcare insurers that insure people at free market rates for catastrophic injuries that are unlikely to happen. And then there's the vast majority of the healthcare system. Again, I'm painting what I view as a common consensus world we want to live in. The vast majority of the healthcare system is a free market where people purchase time from a doctor. They purchase operations, elective surgeries they want to do, whether it's anything from Botox or IVs to LASIK surgeries to skin care operations, to even like an elective hip replacement. Some of these things are considerable expenses. And so there's different market providers out there for different insurances. And you could buy different insurance plans based on what type of healthcare insurance you want. And so I think that healthy market, thriving and beating and competitive and constantly innovating, and the middle market is what you want. And the fringes is what distracts everybody. The fringe to say, oh, he was really, really poor. And, if you're really, really poor, or if you have a very unusual healthcare and expensive and unforeseen catastrophic illness, those are outliers. And you can take special concern from those from a moral perspective, because we care as humans about other humans, not just because they're a financial instrument to a better economy, but because they're human beings that experience the world like I do. So I think recognizing that and drawing special, small, to your point, Brian, which I think is brilliant, keeping things small scale. Like, it doesn't need to inflate from a simple policy is if you can't afford something and you have an emergency treatment, then you get access to it. But to draw a bigger conclusion that everyone gets all healthcare for free is just, that's where I think that it gets very convoluted and politically corrupt, frankly.
Well, absolutely. And there, unfortunately, no matter what system you choose, if the individual is not going to care for their own health and not make lifestyle choices that's going to fortify their health, I don't care what system you choose, it's ultimately going to bring itself down. I have friends that are in the healthcare world, and they started very idealistic. And they said, I had a patient come in, and they were 195 pounds overweight. And I told them that they are going to be, well, they're already pre-diabetic, and they're already starting to show some diabetic circulation issues where sores are not healing and things of that level. They're already showing diabetic retinopathy and things of that nature. And first year, second year, they're even heavier. Third year, they're even worse. Fourth year, they're already on insulin. Fifth year, they're on double that insulin. And slowly but surely, their lifestyle choices, whether they are addicted to food or not, we're not getting into that part, just the lifestyle choices that have befallen this person, they now become more and more costly to the healthcare system. So here's what a lot of my friends wind up telling me. After a while, when people come in, they give them the story. Most people say, listen, I don't need to have you tell me I'm fat. I'm already knowing that. Just give me my treatment and let me go. All right. So now the next question is, when that person starts creating more and more pressure on a healthcare system, it also creates more and more pressure on the provider. So these folks now say, when a person comes in, how many procedures are we able to bill this person for? And anybody who's listening to me that's in medicine knows exactly what I'm talking about. Anybody who disagrees that this exists is a liar. So now what happens after you've gotten connected into the medical system long enough, you look at a person and you say, what can we build the system for on this person? How can we maximize the billings?
Yeah, how can we maximize the expenses?
That's right.
It is so convoluted.
So now I got to ask you, that system will exist under a socialized medical system because everybody's going to say, listen, listen, this guy, we have an MRI machine and we're going to use it, even though they don't need an MRI. We can get away with saying he needs one. We can do this, we can do that, we can do this, we can do that. And it sounds like it's doing great, but is the person healthier? I got to tell you something.
I know, right? You've got to focus on that as the end.
Well, this is something that might fascinate you. We are, in the United States of America, the most unhealthiest generation ever to be recorded in history. And that's why when I was telling you about the 1800s, it turns out that was the healthiest generation what was recorded in the
cavemen had the real diet, the grass-fed paleo diet. All fresh food from the ground.
So the question is, this is intimately tied to healthcare. And then you can go to the socialistic route and say everybody has forced calisthenics in the public square at 6 a.m. If you're not there, you get shot at sight. I mean, the problem is you got to go to first principles to fix anything. If you try to fix it all the way at the tail end of it and not at the brain end, you're not going to solve any problem. And that's why this debate is just like redundant and almost useless to most people to have, because they're talking about the tail and we're not talking about the brain. The brain is, why is that person in the healthcare system to begin with? If we are, in fact,
I agree with you, Brian.
If we are in fact if we are in fact so technologically advanced with all of our equipment and all of our procedures, and everybody's living longer, which we aren't, and everybody's healthier, and if we aren't, our healthcare system isn't exactly what we think it is. Because I can prove, and so a lot of other people can prove, that prior generations, even the World War II generation and prior to that, were actually physically more fit and physically more healthy. Yeah, I know.
And by design, it shrinks. All right, Brian.
So,
well, this has been
that's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been an awesome conversation. We've covered a lot of ground.
A lot of ground, man. My head's spinning.
We talked about capitalism, socialism, healthcare, education, the history of the the tribes, not Sonoran, the Sumerian tribes.
Yeah.
We of course, the Egyptian pyramids, couldn't have a show without that.
Yep.
And very much look forward to the next show, Brian.
Let me leave it with one word. You want to fix the problem? Take care of the people you love first. Period. If everybody
Amen.
did that, we wouldn't have so many problems in this world. Just do it. Take care of the people you love. I don't care if they made you mad. Take care of them.
Yep.
That's it.
All right, Faisal. Well, if you're listening,
Faisal,
we will be in for next
we
show.
miss you again, man. Thank you, Faisal.
All right, my man.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the hosts, co-hosts, and guests appearing on the show and do not necessarily reflect the view of the owners and producers of the show. Paid advertisements in form of audio announcements may appear throughout the show, including this one. Advertising can also include print and other digital formats. The owners and producers of Around the Coin do not endorse or evaluate the advertised product, service, or company, nor any of the claims made by the advertisement. All programs are subject to a one-time charge for professional editing fees, for which the interviewing guest or guests may have contributed towards. The owners, producers, hosts, co-hosts, and guests on the show are not financial advisors. Any investment advice or opinion cited during the show is for information purposes only. None of the content is intended to be investment advice. Seek a duly licensed professional for investment advice. If you believe there's been any violation of your copyright, trademark, service mark, or any other type of intellectual property, please inform us in writing by sending an email to legal@aroundthecoin.com.